Hello, everyone. This week, we will be talking about qualitative research and specifically qualitative data analysis. So far in our class, we have focused a lot on quantitative data, how quantitative data is collected, how it is, how uh, how variables are measured, and then how the data is analyzed. This week, we will focus more specifically on qualitative research. So we'll look a little briefly at the various types of qualitative methods that are employed, how qualitative analysis is conducted, and then what are some of the ways in which methodological rigor or trustworthiness of qualitative data may be increased. Um, so we've sort of talked about the different study purposes in our previous classes. So studies can be descriptive, exploratory, explanatory, evaluative. Now, typically, qualitative research is most often used in exploratory studies or even descriptive studies, but sometimes they may also be used in explanatory or evaluative ways. So, in order to understand underlying causes of a particular phenomenon, especially if it's an area that is very underexplored or there isn't a whole lot of information. Um, it might also be used to supplement data that is being collected quantitatively to try and understand a phenomenon not only in ways that are generalizable to the population, but also understand more in depth why a particular phenomenon is happening or how a program or an intervention is specifically benefiting its individual recipients. So, uh, research methods may be quantitative or qualitative, and the major distinction between quantitative research and qualitative research is its purpose. So, in the case of quantitative research, the emphasis is on measuring your variables, looking at a phenomenon across a population, and then trying to generalize the findings of a study from conducted with a sample. You're trying to generalize that to your population. In qualitative research, generalizability is not as important. You're not collecting qualitative data to be able to then say that this is what is happening in the case of the entire population. Rather, you are more focused on capturing the in-depth experiences of an individual. So you are looking at, in qualitative research focuses on the lived experiences of individuals. It is looking at why a particular individual is benefiting for a program or not, how they are feeling, and then how they are processing their feelings. So it really, the idea is to go deeper and then to provide richer observations about a phenomenon and not so much generalizing from a sample to a population. Um, so qualitative research really attempts to make sense of an ongoing process. Again, oftentimes qualitative research is used in exploratory studies. So when we do not know a whole lot about a phenomenon, we're trying to understand how these concepts relate to each other. We're trying to understand what the effect of a particular phenomenon might be. We're trying to understand what the dimensions of a particular issue are. You may use qualitative research to understand in depth the different experiences of individuals, and that may in future help you develop more targeted measures or specific questions on a survey. So it might guide you in the future to develop more quantitative studies that specifically then measure the phenomenon on a larger scale. So phenomenology over here is just a type of qualitative research. It is again it basically says that there are multiple ways of interpreting the same experience, and phenomenological studies focus on the participants' viewpoint in how they understand their world, how they describe a particular phenomenon. So a participant's description of a particular phenomenon. So, qualitative research method approaches may vary. So, a study may be ethnography, that is, this is the most established and the oldest form of qualitative research. It's been used extensively in anthropology, sociology, and other social sciences, even in social work. Here, a researcher is really immersing themselves in a particular culture or in the everyday lives of the participants, and then gathering data in depth about the culture, about the experiences, about the lives of the people that the researcher is studying, and then reporting that. Case studies are another form of qualitative research method. Here, a researcher may focus on any one case or on multiple cases, and then examines that individual, the group, the family, or the organization, and tries to collect data from numerous sources about this particular case, and then understand how or describe this particular case. So, for instance, the study that I did for my PhD dissertation focused on what are some of the factors that influence decision making by philanthropic organizations. So I wanted to see what factors influence an organization to decide who it's going to give funds to, and who and what kind of grants it wants to support, right? So and my approach was a multiple case study. So I looked at 5 organizations. I collected data from through interviews, through going through their websites, through various available online resources, and then looked at each case study and looked at the decision-making process specifically for each of these organizations. So that would be an example of a case study. You can focus on one case or on multiple cases. Participatory action research projects are really a way to involve your respondents or your participants in your project. So they are oftentimes in participatory action research, you will include your participants in order to and understand what their needs are, what their understanding of a problem is, what their priorities are, and then use that information from your participants to then conduct action research. This is again used a lot in public health fields, where you might often use for example, you want to do community health projects, then researchers may often and I've done a lot of community health projects with qualitative research, where you really go into a community, you ask people what understand what their needs are, what they want the focus to be on in a particular for a particular project, and then you're taking your participants' inputs at every stage of the research process. Focus group discussions, many of you might be familiar with. It is bringing a group together, conducting a focus group discussion. A researcher will often facilitate the group discussion on particular issues and try to understand what the group's feelings are, or what their experiences are at a group level about a particular event or a particular phenomenon, or what their reactions to a particular intervention might be. Focus group discussions are used extensively in market research, which you may be familiar with, but it's also used in a lot of behavioral health research and health research, especially because sometimes it may be too time consuming to try and do individual interviews with every participant, and sometimes focus group discussion may just be more suited based on the topic that you're studying. So this is an example of an ethnographic project. You can Google gang leaders for a day and just and there are a few videos as well on YouTube that you will be able to find about this study, which kind of gives a little bit of details about this ethnographic project. It's a very fascinating ethnographic project that was done by a sociologist. This is an example of a participatory action research project where the study included 15 community residents from these specific neighborhoods to empirically document what the impact of their community violence has been. Again, interesting study, very interesting study. I would recommend doing a Google search and looking to see what you can find about this project if you're interested in an example of a participatory action research project. So in terms of qualitative data, so typically when you're collecting quantitative data, what you are using a lot of is so in quantitative data, you'll be using questionnaires, you might use surveys, you might use observations, that is, you might use testing, and you're using different kinds of quantitative measures to collect data about a particular phenomenon and understand the relationship between variables. In the case of qualitative data, you're not really using the same measures or same tools of data collection as quantitative data, as you would in quantitative research. So in qualitative data, some of the common forms of data that is collected is through analyzing photos, audios, or videos. Photo voice is a great example of qualitative research projects that involve photos, analyzing photographs, or you ask participants to go around and take photos that really capture their experiences. And there are very fascinating photo voice projects with qualitative data, and I'll give a couple of links with examples of photo voice projects under your resources for this week. It may also be qualitative data may also be conducted through interviews and focus group discussions, which is talk. It might be through observation, which is both participant observation, where the researcher is actively participating in when they are observing their participants, or it may be non-participant observation, where a researcher is not participating in the social setting that they are observing. And qualitative data analysis can also happen using by analyzing content of web pages or social media, which is content analysis. So again, a qualitative data, you would really not be using a survey or a questionnaire or test a particular or conduct a particular test. Instead, you'll be collecting data through observations, sometimes through text and visual analysis, and you may collect data. Most commonly, data is collected through interviews. These interviews, so to conduct these interviews, researchers may use tools such as interview guides. These interview guides may be unstructured, where the researcher goes in really with no specific questions and then kind of just sees where the conversation is going. A much more common approach is using interview guide approach. So informal conversation interviews might happen in ethnographic studies a lot more. And if you're doing specifically interviews or in-depth interviews, or you're doing focus group discussions, then typically you may use semi-structured interview guides to collect information about a particular participant or about a particular group. So an interview guide would be your tool for data collection, similar in qualitative research, similar to what a survey or a measure would be when using quantitative when collecting quantitative data. Okay. So in qualitative research, another important thing to remember is that the researcher plays a very important role. A researcher is an observer, but they are also a part of the data that they're collecting, and just being part of the research process changes the data that they are collecting. So it might just be a researcher. So just being a part of the project, you are really influencing the data that you are collecting. And in qualitative research, that is something that you acknowledge, that a researcher is not just simply an objective observer, but rather in some ways they are a participant in the research process. And therefore, you, as a researcher, you will document what your subjectivity is, what your lens is, what your perspective is, and you will always be vigilant of your own role in the research project. So, and that's again another area where qualitative research is very different from quantitative research, which is supposed to be where the assumption is that the research is study can stand in itself, it can be replicated, and the researcher itself is value-free, is objective, and is distant from the research process. So speaking about collecting data, which is recording or transcribing, you use an interview guide, you collect your data, and then once you have your data, the next step is usually, so when you're collecting your data, typically you want to record your data because you want to try and most accurately remember the conversations that have happened. So whenever you're conducting an interview, typically you would audio record that interview. Some cases, more recently, you can do video recordings, but that might again might have confidentiality challenges. So once you have audio recorded the interviews, you then transcribe the interviews. Try and of course make sure that your audio recorder works. The interviews are transcribed immediately, and then you are removing, identifying informations, and you're notating what are the questions being asked by the researcher, and then what are the participant responses, and what are follow-up questions that you might want to ask in a subsequent interview. So once you have your transcript in hand, the very first step of qualitative data analysis is called coding. So this is the very first step in reducing, in what is called data reduction. So say you have done an interview, and you have your interview, when you have transcribed it, it's 25 pages for one person, right? Which is not uncommon if it's like an hour or an hour and a half long interview. And then again, which is not uncommon for large qualitative projects, where you do multiple of these 1 or 2 hour interviews, and you would have very easily hundreds of pages of data in even a medium-sized qualitative research. So that's a lot of data to go through, and this isn't as simple as just kind of plugging in your data into SPSS and then letting the software run the analysis. Here you are instead using qualitative coding, which is often you will break up your data into small, manageable, and meaningful chunks of data, and then assign words or short phrases to a chunk of data that sort of captures the essence, or it summarizes that chunk of data. And this process of assigning words or summative labels to chunks of data is what is known as coding. And the idea is, as you keep coding your data, you will look at the codes and the labels that you're assigning and then identify what might be some patterns that are reoccurring within each case as well as across each case. So let's see. So this is an example of some of the steps for qualitative data coding. I will just let you go through this and then let me know if you have any questions about these stages. Once you have coded all your data, you will look at all your codes across all your data and then look for patterns across the data. And this is what is known as thematic analysis. So in thematic analysis, you are trying to identify patterns or meanings across a data set. And then once you you're looking across your interviews across all your codes to try and see what themes emerge about the data. So let's look at a specific example. So say you have conducted an interview where a participant talks about the differences in what drinking their drinking experiences were when they were in college versus what they are now, what it is now as a young professional. So in this case, you can see that a number of codes have been assigned to the data to summarize what the participant is talking about, right? So this is what your code list from, say, half of your transcript would look like. And then you may want to narrow down on those codes even further and look and try and see what patterns emerge. Can you organize these codes in terms of some kind of hierarchy? So for instance, you may want to distinguish between drinking when they were young and drinking now. And then when they are in terms of drinking in college, you may want to break it up in terms of drinking behavior, type of alcohol that they were drinking, what the consequences are, and again, in now, what the drinking behavior or purpose looks like, what the type of alcohol is, and what the consequences of drinking are, and then kind of compare between the two. So in that case, you would then move on to your thematic analysis and look at your interview level data and then and the codes that you have, and then look for patterns or themes. So these might be 3 themes that you come up with from looking at all your codes across all your interviews. So one of the themes maybe that this study found is drinking is a social activity. And then within it, there might be sub-themes such as drinking might be associated with a sense of community. It might be a way to meet new people. It might be a way to maintain old ties. Again, another theme would be changes in alcohol consumption. So then again, the sub-theme would be then and now. So how has alcohol consumption changed? And then finally, cost and consequences. So these are examples of some themes and then some sub-themes that you would then use to present your results and findings. So when you're looking at a qualitative research project, oftentimes you will find that in the results section of a qualitative article, the researchers have presented themes and then sub-themes that explain, that really try and capture the data. And this is what you're sort of doing in your coding and then subsequently your thematic analysis process. There are different types of codes that you can assign. I'm not really going to go into this. You may want to code open so that you're just looking at the data, you're trying to see what speaks to you, and then you're trying to capture the codes. coding, you can code for concept, you can code into categories, you can code in terms of properties, dimensions, subcategories. And then these are some examples of coding illustration. So you're looking at the data, you're looking at chunks of the data, and then you are identifying, attaching different codes to the data. So we talked about reflexivity a little bit earlier when I talked about the role of the researcher. It is something that is important because you recognize as a qualitative researcher that you play a part in in what you're studying, and therefore it is important to always think critically about your own role in the research process and constantly reflect on it. And this is what reflexivity speaks of. And these are some ways in which you would try and maintain your reflexivity through the process. And then finally, talking about data trustworthiness, there are various ways in which qualitative data can be examined to make sure that the findings are authentic and its interpretations are credible. So you may want to check with your members. So you may want to check with your participants and show them what your findings are and see whether, and ask them if that really captures what their experiences are. You may want to use multiple people who code the same data to make sure that you're trying to limit the subjectivity involved in the coding process. So you want to see that is everybody are a group of people who have received the same coding instructions and the same data is going to code similarly, and are they going to come up with themes similarly? And then you work in groups to then try and see what your similarities are and where your differences are. So there are various ways in which data trustworthiness or qualitative study rigor can be tested. Another way would be to see whether there has been a prolonged engagement period with your subject. So have your subjects really been involved in multiple stages of your study? Has the researcher been present and interacted with the participants on an ongoing process, built rapport, built trust, and then gone back and to the participants with their data. And so these are various evaluative criteria on which you can see whether qualitative data is rigorous, the qualitative data collected is rigorous or not. And these are some threats to trustworthiness. So I've gone over the various differences between the qualitative and quantitative research. So make sure you complete the readings, watch the links, or go through the required links for this week. And let me know if you have any questions about qualitative data analysis. Thank you for watching this video and have a great week ahead.